I always found solace in the early hours before the world stirred. The city was still, its usual noise muffled by the blanket of winter. I could step outside and feel like the world was my own, just me and the crisp air. The fog in the streets wrapped everything in mystery, and the silence that hung in the air was calming in its own way. I had always run in the mornings long before the sun rose, when the streets were empty and the only sounds were the rhythm of my feet hitting the pavement. That day, I didn't expect anything to be different. I pulled my hood tighter against the cold, tying my sneakers, and stepped into the dim world. The streetlights above flickered every now and then, casting weak glimmers that barely cut through the thick, foggy haze. It felt like I was running through a dream. The fog seemed to hold the world captive, leaving the street eerily quiet. The kind of quiet that made every step sound louder than it was. But that was the charm of early mornings, wasn't it? You could lose yourself in that emptiness, in the simplicity of breathing, running, and feeling the cold sharpness fill your lungs. But as I moved deeper into the fog, something in the air shifted. It was subtle at first, just a small unease that sat like a stone in my stomach. I chalked it up to fatigue. The fog was thick, like a wall of smoke that made it harder to see, harder to breathe. I kept running, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe it was the loneliness, the stillness. By the time I reached the park, I could feel the change though. Normally the park would be filled with joggers, dog walkers, or people talking in the distance. But this morning there was no one. Not a soul. It was like I had stepped into a different world, one where no one existed but me. I picked up my pace, doing laps in the empty park, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. But as I finished the first lap and started the second, I began to hear faint footsteps behind me. At first I thought it was just my imagination, a product of the fog's disorienting grip, but then it happened again, closer this time. My pulse quickened, and I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone. But there was no one, just thick fog wrapping around everything like a suffocating veil. I slowed down, my instincts urging me to stop and look. Maybe I was just tired, I thought. Maybe it was nothing. But the feeling of being followed wouldn't leave. It wasn't just the footsteps, it was the weight of the silence around me, how everything felt off. I kept going, but my steps felt heavier, my breath quicker. At the third lap, I could hear the footsteps for sure pacing behind me. Closer, too close. My heart began to race, and I stopped spinning on my heel, expecting to see someone, but no one was there. I called out, my voice breaking through the fog, but the only response was the eerie hum of the wind, the trees swaying like dark figures in the distance. I moved to a bench by the playground, hoping to catch my breath, to shake the fear that had gripped my chest. But then I heard it like dry leaves being crushed underfoot, the unmistakable sound of someone walking closer. My blood ran cold. I turned quickly, scanning the fog, but nothing. Then I heard it again, that sound followed by a soft chuckle. It sent chills down my spine. The sound was wrong, hollow, like it belonged in a nightmare. "Who's there?" My voice was a whisper, hoarse with fear, but I forced the words out. There was no answer. The fog swallowed my call, but the chuckle came again, closer now. That's when she stepped into view. A woman. But not like any woman I had ever seen. She was tall, with pale, lifeless skin, and her hair hung in limp, matted red strands. She wore a torn nightgown stained dark crimson, almost unrecognizable as something once white. My breath caught in my throat, but I couldn't look away. Her eyes locked onto mine, wild, bloodshot, smeared with dark makeup as if she hadn't slept or eaten in days. I felt the ground beneath me shift, my body frozen in place, unable to move. She smiled at me, but it wasn't a smile that belonged to any normal person. It was a twisted, feral grin that made my skin crawl. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't obey. Her hand lifted, and I saw the severed finger. Blood dripped from it, staining the snow beneath her feet. A wedding ring dangled from the finger, swaying slightly in the air. My stomach turned. I felt the bile rise in my throat, and my heart pounded painfully in my chest. The woman raised the finger higher, her smile widening. "He doesn't need to hide his affair anymore," she said, her voice trembling with glee, as though she had won some terrible victory. "Not married anymore." I stumbled back, my body finally catching up with the terror that flooded through me. My mind was racing, trying to process what I was seeing, what she had said. I couldn't focus. My hands fumbled for my phone, my fingers slipping as I dialed 911. My heart hammered in my chest as I waited for the operator, as I watched the woman collapse to the ground in front of me. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and she crumpled in a heap, just gone. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I couldn't move. I dialed again, my hands shaking so badly it was a miracle I got through. It felt like an eternity before the sirens arrived, slicing through the fog, pulling me from the horror. The police came, took the woman away, but not before they told me who she was. Sophia, they said. She had killed her husband after believing he was having an affair. In a fit of rage, she had severed his finger and wandered the streets, lost in her madness. They told me she would be sent to a mental institution. That she hadn't spoken since that night, not a word, just silence. I didn't go back to the park. I didn't run in the mornings anymore. The fog, that heavy winter fog, had taken more than just the quiet, it had taken my peace. And I was left with the memory of the woman, the blood, and the feeling that sometimes the silence isn't as safe as it seems. It was the kind of night that left you feeling small, like the world was too big, and you were a speck lost in it. A few days before the new year, and I had just wrapped up my shift at the office. I worked at a small marketing firm in a run-down building on the outskirts of town. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady work. That night, though, had been one of those late shifts, one of those days that never seemed to end, where the clock ticked slower and slower until finally it was nearly midnight and I was heading out into the cold. The city streets were mostly deserted. The quiet felt oppressive, like the city had fallen asleep, but I was still wide awake, my senses buzzing. The world felt different at night, calmer, quieter, but also a little bit more unsettling. I don't know what it was about being alone in the dark, with only the faint hum of streetlights and the distant sound of traffic in the background. But that night it felt like the calm before a storm. I walked out of the building, my footsteps echoing off the cracked concrete, my breath fogging in the chilly air. The sound of my boots crunching on the snow was the only noise breaking the stillness. I tugged my coat tighter around my body, my fingers fumbling for my keys as I made my way to my car. It wasn't much a faded, old sedan that I'd had for years. It had seen better days, but it was reliable, even if it looked like it might break down at any moment. I unlocked the car and slid into the driver's seat, feeling the chill of the fabric against my skin. My fingers fumbled for the ignition and I turned the key, hearing the engine sputter to life. The heater didn't kick in right away, so I sat there waiting for it to warm up, staring out at the snowy street in front of me. The roads weren't great. Snow from earlier in the evening had turned into slick ice, and I knew I'd have to take it slow. I started driving cautiously, my hands gripping the wheel tight as the car slipped slightly on patches of ice. Every now and then the tires would lose traction, and for a brief moment my heart would race as I fought to regain control. It wasn't enough to make me panic, but it was enough to make me realize how dangerous it could be out there. The drive felt like it was stretching on forever. I wasn't far from home, but the longer I drove, the more tired I became, my eyes straining to keep focused. The city lights faded behind me as I drove into the more rural outskirts, where the roads were barely lit and snowbanks lined the streets. I knew I was getting close, but the exhaustion was starting to weigh on me, making everything feel slower and more surreal. And then just like that, the car slid again. This time it wasn't a quick slip, it was a full slide, the kind of thing that made your stomach drop and your breath catch in your throat. I tried to steer the car, but it wasn't responding. The next thing I knew, I was sliding off the road and into a snowbank. I wasn't going fast, but the car seemed to sink deeper and deeper into the snow, the wheels spinning uselessly. Finally, it stopped, wedged awkwardly at the edge of a ditch. My heart was pounding, but I was still in one piece. For a moment I sat there, staring out at the snow, trying to process what had just happened. There was no way I was getting out of this without help. I knew I'd have to call for roadside assistance, but my phone had died hours ago. I could feel the frustration building in my chest. It was late, I was exhausted, and now I was stuck in the middle of nowhere with no way to get home. I sighed and put my hands over my face, trying to calm myself down. I had to think clearly if I was going to get out of this. As I sat there, stewing in frustration, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. A truck was coming toward me, slowing as it approached. I couldn't make out the details at first, but when it pulled up beside me and stopped, I could see it was a large silver pickup. A man leaned out of the driver's side window and called out to me. "You need a hand?" he asked, his voice rough but kind. "I can tow you out if you want." I hesitated for a moment. The last thing I wanted was to rely on some random stranger in the middle of nowhere. But then I thought about the $200 towing fee and the possibility of waiting for hours for assistance. I needed help and he was offering. Maybe I was just desperate, but I nodded. "Yeah, that would be great." "I'd really appreciate it," I said. He gave me a nod and told me to wait there while he went to get his tow hitch. I watched him drive off, his truck disappearing into the distance. I didn't know what to think. Should I call for roadside assistance just in case? What if he didn't come back? What if he was just playing me? The longer I sat there, the more my mind raced with all the worst-case scenarios. My thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock on my window. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. I turned, expecting to see the man with the tow truck. But instead, there was a stranger standing outside, a man dressed in thick winter layers, his face mostly covered by a scarf. His eyes were dark, and he was staring at me with an intensity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I cracked the window slightly, trying to gauge his intentions. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice tight. He didn't answer. He just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Something about the way he stood there made my skin crawl. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I didn't trust him. I was about to close the window when I heard the unmistakable sound of the door latch clicking open. My stomach dropped as I realized what was happening. Before I could react, the man reached through the crack in the window and unlocked the door. I panicked, my hand scrambling to grab the door and slam it shut. But it was too late. The man had already opened it and was reaching inside, grabbing me with a force I couldn't fight off. I tried to kick, to push, but he was bigger, stronger. He yanked me out of the car and into the snow, pulling me away from the road and toward the dark woods. I screamed, but the wind swallowed the sound, and my body felt like it was made of lead as I fought against his grip. I don't know how long I struggled, but I felt myself weakening, my limbs going numb from the cold and the fear. Just as I thought I couldn't keep fighting, headlights flooded the area. The truck. The man with the tow truck had returned. He shouted something at the stranger, his voice harsh, and the man immediately let go of me, running into the woods without another word. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, my head spinning. The man from the truck rushed over, pulling me to my feet and wrapping me in his jacket. He didn't say much, but his presence was calming, reassuring. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft. I nodded, still in shock. I didn't know what to say. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving me with a deep, bone-chilling exhaustion. The man helped me back to the road, where he called the police and gave a statement. He stayed with me the whole time, making sure I was okay, making sure I wasn't alone. When the police arrived, they took my statement, and the night began to feel like a blur. The cold wasn't as sharp anymore, but the memory of what had almost happened lingered. The man from the truck had saved me. He had gone out of his way to help, and without him, I don't know what would have happened. I wouldn't even be here telling this story. As the sirens faded into the distance, I realized something. I had learned a harsh lesson that night, one I'd never forget. Not all strangers are out to hurt you, but sometimes the world can be a dangerous place, and you can't always trust your instincts. But then again, sometimes a stranger's kindness can be the very thing that saves your life. And for that, I would be forever grateful. It's been years since that night, but the memory of it is still so vivid in my mind. I don't know if I'll ever forget it, but I'll never forget the way my heart raced, how time seemed to stretch, and how I was completely alone in the middle of nowhere with a stranger who seemed to know exactly what he was doing. It was the winter break, the few days between Christmas and New Year's. I was young, just 17, and still figuring things out. I'd gotten a part-time job at a local pizza place, one of those small, family-owned spots that everyone in town knew about. The hours were flexible, which was great for a high school student, and it didn't hurt that I was making decent money for the first time. Every paycheck felt like I was living the high life. That day, I figured the pizza shop wouldn't be too busy. People were still off celebrating with their families, right? But it was like I'd missed some unspoken rule. As soon as I clocked in, orders started flooding in. There was barely a moment to breathe, and by the time dinner rolled around, it was utter chaos. I ended up taking delivery orders, something I wasn't thrilled about, but I knew the more deliveries I made, the bigger my paycheck. I was given one order in particular that stood out. It was for a house way out on the edge of town, about a 20-minute drive from the pizza shop. Not exactly close, but not terribly far either. I thought to myself, at least the road should be quiet. The Christmas rush was over and everyone else would be at home, probably cozy with their families. The roads were eerily empty, and the air felt strangely still. No one was out walking, no cars passed by, just me and the open road. The house was off the main road, tucked away at the end of a long gravel drive. It wasn't in any neighborhood I recognized, just a large, isolated property. As I pulled up to the house, I was struck by how festive it looked, too festive. Strings of lights, inflatable snowmen, and plastic reindeer everywhere. It felt almost comical, like the owner had tried a little too hard to make it look like the ideal holiday home. But what struck me more than the over-the-top decorations was the driveway. It was covered in thick snow, untouched, no tire tracks, no footprints leading up to the house. It was as if no one had been home for days. Odd, I thought, but maybe they'd just been too busy with the holidays to shovel. I parked my car, grabbed the pizza, and walked up the path to the porch. As I approached the door, I noticed something that didn't sit right with me. There were fresh footprints in the snow leading up to the house, but the footprints didn't go directly to the door. They veered off to the side and wrapped around the house. I didn't know what to make of it. I figured maybe someone else had come by and walked around the side. Maybe they were fixing something or getting something out of the yard. I shrugged it off and knocked. No answer. I knocked again. Nothing. The air was still, and I could hear the faint sound of snow falling around me, but no movement from inside. I thought it was strange, so I checked the receipt to make sure I was at the right address. Everything matched up. I knocked a third time, a little harder this time, growing more impatient. Still, no response. The house was silent. I stood there for a moment, feeling increasingly uneasy. The fresh footprints, the strange silence, the untouched driveway, it was all adding up to something I couldn't quite place. My frustration started building, and I turned away to head back to my car, but as I reached the driveway, I tried starting my car, and it wouldn't turn over. The engine sputtered and stalled. I muttered a curse under my breath and tried again. And again. Nothing. My hands were getting colder and colder, and panic began to creep in. It was strange enough that no one had answered the door, but now my car wouldn't start. My mind raced with thoughts of what I should do. I was starting to feel trapped, isolated in the middle of nowhere, and then I saw him. He appeared from the side of the house, slowly walking toward me. The first thing I noticed was how bundled up he was: boots, thick coat, scarf, gloves. He was completely covered. I couldn't see his face, and that made my gut twist. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Maybe he was just another person from the neighborhood who had come to check on the house. I wasn't sure what I expected, but I did know I didn't like the way he was walking toward me. Slow, deliberate, like he knew I was stuck. I got out of the car and approached him, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey, did you order the pizza? I've been knocking for a while." He didn't answer. Instead, he kept walking, not speeding up, not slowing down. It was unsettling. Something about the way he moved made my blood run cold. He wasn't in any kind of hurry. I took a step back, my heart pounding now. I felt the knot of panic tighten in my chest. I hurried back to my car, the door slamming behind me as I locked it. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The operator answered, and I tried to explain the situation, my voice shaky, but I could barely focus on what I was saying. I kept glancing at the man who was still walking toward me. He didn't seem to care that I had a phone in my hand. Then he spoke. His voice was deep, almost too deep, like he was trying to keep his tone calm. "Do you need help?" The question hit me like a jolt of ice water. How did he know I needed help? My stomach twisted. I told the operator my location, feeling like I was about to throw up from the sheer terror of it all. My eyes locked onto the man, and I could see that he was looking around, checking the area like he was searching for something, maybe me. I turned the key in the ignition, praying the car would start. The engine sputtered again, but didn't catch. The man kept moving closer, his eyes fixed on mine. There was nothing I could do. The window was my only barrier between him and me, and I was beginning to feel trapped. Then he started reaching into his pockets. I didn't know what he was looking for, but the way his hands moved frantically, I knew it wasn't good. His face twisted into a look of panic, and then with a force I didn't expect, he punched the window, trying to break it. I could hear the glass rattling. My heart pounded in my chest as I scrambled for any way to get the car started. The fear was overwhelming. Just as I was about to lose all hope, he stopped. He backed away from the car and ran to the side of the house, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't know what he was doing, but I didn't wait to find out. I sat there, frozen, for what felt like hours. Then, I saw the flashing lights, blue and red. I knew the police were close. The man had seen the lights too, and when he realized help had arrived, he took off running. I didn't know where he went or what he was planning to do next, but I didn't care. The relief that flooded through me was immediate, but it didn't erase the fear I'd felt just moments before. The police showed up, but by the time they got there, the man was gone. I later learned that the house was empty. The owners had been away visiting family for the holidays. The man wasn't part of the family at all. He had somehow managed to plug in the Christmas lights outside, trying to make it look like the house was occupied. And while I was standing on the porch, he had tampered with my car, somehow disabling it so I couldn't leave. I don't know exactly what he had planned for me, but I have a feeling it wasn't good. Maybe he had intended to take me. But something went wrong. He must have dropped the tool, maybe a knife or something, when he went to break my window. That's why he ran off to get it. I never found out for sure, but I don't think I want to know. After that night, I stopped taking deliveries. The fear of being trapped again, of being alone in the dark, in the middle of nowhere with someone who might have meant me harm, was too much. I don't think I could handle it again. And even now, every time I drive down that road, I get that uneasy feeling. I can't shake it.